Sam Hovan back with you here at halftime, Longwood, the Jerome Kersey Classic, and I'm joined by Kerry Eggers, a special guest. Kerry, I really appreciate you stopping by. You've had a book, it's been out for a little bit more than a month, Overcoming the Odds. It's the guy who's really the namesake of this tournament. You covered him tremendously in your extensive writing career as well. I want to get into some questions because I just think the book was so fascinating to read. How do you approach when you first start writing a book like this? How do you approach it?
Well, this was different, Sam, than anything I've ever done because he's no longer with us. And how do you go about it? First, you get the people that knew him best, teammates, family, and that sort of thing. And then secondly, luckily, Hope Kerry, the former sports information director at Longwood, had done extensive interviews with him during his time still in the NBA. So I used a lot of that and just put it together.
What was fun about writing a book like this?
Fun was talking to the people that knew him, and I knew a lot of those guys. I covered him during the heyday in the early 90s, Clyde Drexler's, Terry Porter. Terry wrote the foreword for us, and Charles Barkley, John Stockton, some guys that had played against him and knew him very well. So I think it was the people that I connected with during it was the fun part.
Well, and it's interesting because you talk about guys that you covered, but now you're talking about somebody that you also covered. So you as a writer, somebody that you covered, what was something that surprised you about it?
Well, I get asked that a lot. I don't think anything really surprised me because Jerome was an open book. He was a guy that didn't really change. One thing that struck me was the guys that knew him then, the Longwood days or even earlier, felt that he was the same guy after he was a star in the NBA, and that's a neat thing to say. He was a very charismatic guy, a guy with a lot of character, and that came from his upbringing in nearby Clarksville here.
I think one of the things that stood out to me when I was reading it was just it was amazing to see the stories of, he goes and visits a hospital and brings along a bunch of his superstar teammates and doesn't tell anybody. He just goes and does it. What's it like when you get to be around a guy like that?
Yeah, another one is that he was working the suites and at the Motor Center and noticed that a lot of the food wasn't being used. So he would go and collect that food at the end of the night, drive it down to the area where the homeless were and distribute it. What kind of people do that? He's a great person. So, yeah, it was... We had a cordial relationship, not a friendly. We weren't friends, but he was a great guy to deal with, and I really enjoyed knowing him.
Well, and it's one of those things. The reporter-player relationship is always really unique.
It is. I tell people this. He's the only professional athlete in 45 years in the business that I invited over for dinner with my family. My kids were big fans of his. They were very young. They still say it was a highlight for them.
What was one of the things that stood out when you had him over?
Well, he had his daughter at the time, and she was 1 year old, a little toddler, bouncing around. Now she's 27. That ages me and Jerome.
I guess the last question I'll have for you is, when somebody reads this book, what's the thing that you want them to get away from this book?
Well, I think it's a motivational book for young people, for sure. A guy that overcoming the odds. From a small town in Virginia, went to a small school. Longwood was not really on the NBA radar. Got a second-round draft pick by the Blazers. Didn't think he was going to make the team. Made the team, and 3 years later was a starter on a great group. And so I think that's the part of it that I would probably take away most.
We really appreciate your time. Again, the book, Overcoming the Odds by Kerry Eggers. It's the story of Jerome Kersey. It's a great read about somebody who's very special to a lot of people here in Farmville. We'll be back with more on halftime here on ESPN Plus after this.